Hi everyone, welcome. My, how quickly things changed. During our last check-in with these two systems 12 days ago, they were still the youngest bins in my wormery, but in the time that has passed since our last check-in with these little guys, we've since launched a newer system. So they're no longer the new kids on the block, but they're still pretty young. It's a 24-day-old system at this point, and we've got a little bit of unfinished business because the material that those little guys used to occupy was set aside based on the assumption that there's probably a good many stragglers remaining in those castings, and we set up a bait box. And the bait box has been out here for the past 24 days trying to round up stragglers, and I did come in here just to look through the material, aerate it a little bit, and I didn't find a single worm in that stuff, and that was many days ago. So I think it's safe to say that we don't even have to check the material. We can just grab this bait box and coordinate a little bit of a family reunion. Get these little guys reunited with the worms that got hauled out 24 days ago to launch those two new systems, and finally consider this as a harvestable batch of castings. So I'm going to really not even spend any time on this. We're just going to go ahead and get the two new systems out on the bench so we can get them fed, and then we'll take care of the family reunion. So let's get started. The foods that we're going to be giving them today is here in this little plastic transport container that I brought down from my freezer. Everything in here has been frozen with the exception of the coffee, and there's a good bit of stuff here. I'm never quite sure of how much I've stacked into this thing until I actually lift it up to bring it down here. Sometimes I'm a little bit surprised by how heavy it is, and there's a good bit of stuff in here. So hopefully they're hungry. Before we get started though, let me just share with you a little bit of information. Last time when we checked in on these guys 12 days ago, I announced to you guys that the estimated worm count numbers were starting to come together with everyone's input, and I believe it was with the help of 7 people who commented, as well as my own estimate, that were all averaged together to come up with these numbers. So over here in bin number 1, it's thought that we've got 2,960 worms, and over here in bin number 2, slightly less, 2,911. So I think based on these estimates, bin number 2 is the place to put the stragglers once we release them. So that's my game plan. I think all the other information on here was touched on already, so we know everything else that's documented on my little information board there. Pretty sure I touched on it when I was speaking earlier. So at 24 days of age, it's fair to assume that this system is pretty rich in bedding still. I would think that in the past 3.5 weeks they've not yet managed to eliminate much of their bedding material, although they've probably done a pretty good number on some of it. You know, these coffee filters that we put in here to indicate where we last fed, they do seem to be holding up pretty good to the onslaught of worms nibbling away on them. And I'm sure the springtails are helping a little bit too. I could see springtails collected here and there in a few spots. But since we got replacement coffee filters that are coming along with the coffee that we're going to feed them, we could simply repurpose these old ones, these old coffee filters, to no longer be feeding zone indicators. We'll just translate or transfer them into a new role of just supplementary bedding to include down in the feeding zone. Because I always like to add my food with a little bit of bedding, and whether it's my fresh prepared bedding or if it's just stuff that's already been in the bin and is now perhaps starting to show some signs of wear, I think we can actually use some of these top covering newspaper, the feeding zone indicator, some of these pieces of cardboard we encountered. I think all these things would work really nicely down in the feeding zone, where all the goodness of the frozen foods as they begin to thaw will sort of drip down into the bedding and make that bedding into almost like an extension of the feeding. So I'm excavating a little bit of a hole, and I find myself here in bin number 2 again, as I often do. I guess multiple reasons, because I guess from my point of view, going from left to right is starting in bin number 2. Whenever I orient the camera, I always try to set it up so that from your perspective, it's left to right, lowest to highest numbers, but you know, this natural left to right way of reading or stuff like that, and I guess also just by the glove being on my left hand all the time, somehow makes my left hand a little bit dominant when it comes to these worm bin check-ins, and I oftentimes find myself working on bin number 2 prior to bin number 1, but there's really no set order to any of this stuff. Sometimes when I remind myself, I try to do things in the proper order. I guess with the word proper in air quotes there. It feels to me like the moisture level in this system is quite nice. Everything I've encountered so far down here in the feeding zone is nice and damp and cozy. I don't really recall offhand what we fed these little guys last time, but I don't see much of anything that appears to me like leftovers. But then again, this system is still, for the most part, bedding, so we could have very easily encountered certain bits and pieces of the stuff we fed last time and just didn't even recognize what it was at this point. But I think just from a gut feeling perspective, I think we're probably in pretty good shape. These little guys are probably ready for their next meal. So I think in addition to these recycled materials that are going to make for a really lovely bedding, foundational bedding to go beneath the feeding, you can also grab my prepared bedding from off the shelf right behind me. It's let's just go ahead and give them a little bit of this too. I mean, in a new system like this, which is still chock full of tons of bedding, it might not seem necessary to add bedding, but it is a good habit to get into. Even if it's a brand new system that's made up almost entirely of bedding still, adding to it is a good thing to do. And, well, let's see how we're going to manage to get all this yummy food to fit in here. On top of the banana peel, I think this might be peaches. I got this stuff from my mom, and I didn't really look it over, but I believe she probably did take the time to extract any of the pits, because I don't see any of them in here. I could see where the pit would belong inside of some of these plums. Did I say peaches before? I'm pretty sure these are plums. Or are they peaches? No, I think they are peaches. I'm sorry. And it looks like we've got at least one pepper top to go into each system, and maybe even a little bit more peach, I believe. But this last piece will split in half to try to be fair. Another pepper top, another pepper top. This is just me trying to be fair. Oops, here's a little bit more stuff with some soup greens or carrots, I guess, the white carrots and the orange carrots. And that pretty much gets us to the coffee. So now what have we here? Oh, okay, these were just some spare coffee filters, which I'm just going to stack up over here. I've got a nice collection of spare coffee filters off on the side, just in case we need one as a feeding zone indicator. But here we've got 2 coming in with the coffee that we're going to give them. So let's add a little bit of grit before we add in the coffee. And then a lot of times when I feed coffee, I try to increase its appeal by including a little bit of my worm chow sprinkled in with it as well. Looks like we spilled some of our coffee off on the side here. It doesn't matter. We're going to just agitate and stir the material on the outskirts a little bit, just so we can kind of use that as an excuse to see how things are looking. So let's proceed to backfilling the feeding zone and at the same time inspecting the outskirts of the bin. or the bins. I guess from a moisture perspective, perhaps things are a little bit more damp down near where the foods had been applied. And I guess that makes sense that the worms would gravitate towards the place in the bin where the majority of the moisture is and where the food was last placed. Over here on this edge, it feels to me ever so slightly more damp. And I suppose as a result of that, we're finding some more worms hanging in this stuff. Usually when I cover my systems in plastic like we've done here, I kind of expect the moisture in the system to just equalize. Whether it's the section of the bin where really damp stuff was added or where moisture was added or not, it does seem to me like the plastic forcing the recirculation of the moisture down within the system is going to allow the moisture to pretty much make its way into all the stuff that make up the system. But I also think that to a certain point agitating things this way helps too, to get the more damp stuff up from down low and out to the surface and vice versa, submerging the more dry stuff that we encounter here and there, or at least mixing it with more damp stuff. And see here once again, for whatever reason, this edge of the bin closer to me seems to be a pretty popular one as far as worms go. And here too, it does seem to me a little bit more moist or damp than the opposite edge. Not sure what the cause of that might be, but it's certainly not much. Clearly enough to cause the worms to gravitate towards the more moist or damp edge, seemingly. But not much of a difference, and I assume that over time it's all going to equalize. So now before we mark where we last fed and proceed to covering up the system, let's not forget we've got some unfinished business here, and I guess the system into which we decided to add the worms from the bait box is bin number 2, right over into here. So I suppose we can already proceed with marking the feeding zone in bin number 1. I guess as a little bit of a reminder so that I don't end up dropping the worms into bin number 1. Bin number 2 is where we're going to put the bait box contents, and this is kind of a nice little bonus. I think we could even tear this piece of paper in half and then drop it in here as replacement top coverings, since we went ahead and we deployed the old top coverings that were pretty far gone already into the feeding zone and turned them into supplementary bedding. And I mean, for that matter, this piece of newspaper here can also get utilized in the same way. I'll play with those while we wait for the wormies to get situated in their new home. Hopefully they appreciate getting returned to the population that they used to live with. I guess here and there I'm seeing little bits of the food that was placed into this bait box to lure the worms out of their bedding below. I see little bits of stems, and I think we even saw pieces of tomato skin. I don't know if a tomato's skin is classified as a peel. And I certainly don't see many worms in here, but there are a few. And sometimes it is a little bit tricky to observe the worms when they're in a material like this, full of bedding and material that, you know, gotta admit, a lot of this bedding actually looks a lot like a worm. So it is a little bit tricky to gauge just how many worms we're dealing with here. But nevertheless, I'm still going to turn to you guys as the viewers to please provide me with your input in terms of how many worms you believe we've just added to bin number 2 over here as a result of emptying the bait box into here. And please leave a comment with what you think we've just increased the population by. So I'm going to give these little guys a moment to settle in. A lot of times we try to gawk at the worms squirming around during one of these worm releases, but I suppose that in the case of this worm release, there's just so much bedding material and so few worms that it's very tricky to see them, but that doesn't change the fact that I'm really looking to hear from everyone. Really looking forward to hearing from everyone what your estimates are on how many worms we just released into there. I've looked this container over and I don't believe I see any worms left behind in it, but I will take another closer look at it momentarily after we're done filming. But I think we are pretty much at the point where we can start covering up these systems. So I wondered if perhaps I can undo this fancy origami that I folded up over here to turn this little mini top covering that was used to create shade in the bait box and use it as the top covering in this system. And then that other piece of paper, similar size, going on, folded over, double layered to become our new top coverings. So I think that brings us to the end of our check-in, and there's going to be a little bit of other to-do, busy work around here for me to take care of, such as emptying that container full of lovely castings and making that bin available for other future worm composting purposes, and naturally all the other to-do items pertaining to getting stuff cleaned up and put away. But naturally I'm not going to keep you around for that stuff because that stuff's boring. But before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.